I want to welcome you this morning. I'm Amy Seawright. I'm Senior Advisor and Director of the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS. And it's my honor to welcome you all to our 9th Annual South China Sea Conference, organized by the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. Today's conference will provide an opportunity to take a look at and analyze developments in the South China Sea over the past year and possible paths forward on these seemingly intractable issues. It was 3 years ago this month that the Arbitral Tribunal at The Hague handed down a ruling on Philippine claims against China under UNCLOS. And it was a real victory for the Philippines and laid out some clear markers for international law. Subsequently to that, in the years since, ASEAN and China have been negotiating the long-delayed Code of Conduct. And for many stretches of time, the waters of the South China Sea have seemed a bit calmer in terms of real tensions. But at the same time, the United States and many other countries have stepped up efforts to exercise freedom of navigation by sailing through the waters of the South China Sea. And in recent months, we've seen a flare-up of tensions between China and the Philippines and standoffs with Chinese Coast Guard vessels and vessels of Malaysia and Vietnam near oil rigs in their respective EEZs. So even though there are some days here in Washington where it seems like the South China Sea has fallen off the radar, the strategic radar here, it's never been more important strategically, the issues surrounding the South China Sea disputes, than it is today. And the number of people in this room, I think, are a testament to the need to continue to focus on the issues involved and find a way to move forward. So we here at CSIS believe it's critical to keep the South China Sea at the center of the policy conversation here in Washington, and we're thrilled that you're here with us today and tuning online. Today's conference will feature speakers from around the world, including from claimant states as well as stakeholders in the region and more globally, and we're grateful for all of our speakers who have traveled great distances to be here. Our panels will cover the state of play in the South China Sea. We'll take a look at the history and historiography of the maritime tensions in the South China Sea, and we will explore different pathways for dispute management and conclude with a discussion about what is at stake globally. And in addition to our distinguished panelists, over lunch we will hear from Admiral Scott Swift, the former commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So before I invite our first panel to commence, let me just make a brief housekeeping announcement. In the unlikely event of an emergency, I will be your safety officer, and you can look to me and other members of our CSIS staff who will lead you outside, away from the emergency, probably across the street to the National Geographic building on M Street. And last but not least, I want to thank those who have provided financial support for today's event, including the embassies of Australia, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, Vietnam's Foundation for East Sea Studies, and general support to CSIS. The grouping of supporters aptly demonstrates the global importance of the South China Sea. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Bonnie Glazier, who will moderate the first panel.
Well, we're going to get started talking about the state of play. I am the director of the China Power Project here at CSIS, and it is a privilege to participate in this year's South China Sea Conference. I want to thank the Southeast Asia Program as well as the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative and their staff, of course, for putting this terrific program together. We always start by looking at what is happening in the South China Sea. And although some observers say that the South China Sea is tranquil and the tensions are easing, I think what we're going to hear is the situation is rather different. There's a lot of activity going on in the South China Sea, and some of it is more public and transparent than others. But one of the purposes today is to have the perspectives from various countries in the region. So we've asked our speakers to talk about their countries, and then in the Q&A we can open up the subject a little bit more broadly. We have Evan Laxmana all the way to my right, who's a senior researcher at CSIS in Jakarta. Dr. Huang Lei Tu is not here for medical reasons. She has sent us a video. And we are going to play part of that video. It is a bit too long, and we do want to leave more time for Q&A. So I apologize in advance that we will cut that a little bit. But we have the opportunity, at least, for you to hear her views. And she, of course, she will be talking about Vietnam. We have Greg Poling, who directs the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative here at CSIS, who is going to be talking about the Philippines. And then finally, to my right, Liu Xiaobo, who is an Associate Research Fellow and Director at the World Navy Research Center and the National Institute for South China Sea Studies. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to limit their remarks to 10 to 12 minutes, and hopefully we will have plenty of time for Q&A to get all of you involved in the conversation as well. So we'll start with you, Evan Laxmana.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thanks to CSIS for having me. I'll just get right to it. So there's four big themes I think I'll talk about today. I'll talk a little bit about the new priorities of the new administration, and I'll talk how that relates to the South China policy of Indonesia. I'll give a little bit of an update on Indonesia and China's Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, I'll talk a little bit at the end about if there's any role for the U.S. to play. So let me be clear from the beginning that Indonesia is a non-claimant state in the South China Sea. So unless there's some major stakes happening for the next 5 years, it's quite unlikely that Indonesia will be involved in pushing a lot of the agendas, except maybe through ASEAN and the Code of Conduct process. So as you can see, these are the 5 new priorities of the administration, and this was a speech about 2 weeks ago, and you'll notice that there's no word of maritime in the speech. The slogan of his first term has to do with the global maritime fulcrum, and I think that's about to be dead right now. The founder of the idea, the current ambassador of Indonesia to London, Rizal Zukma, has said that the global maritime fulcrum that we were so proud to announce 5 years ago is actually on life support. So I think the focus would be a lot more on the domestic agenda of his last term, and it's unlikely that we would be more willing to challenge China on a lot of the stuff in the South China Sea. And because a lot of the agenda has to do with domestic economy and infrastructure, more engagement with China should be expected. So on the South China Sea stuff, the point to make is that South China Sea is not high on the agenda of the new administration, nor has it been in the first administration. As you can see there, it takes a lot of stakeholders when it comes to the South China Sea for Indonesia. So whatever you see with regards to Indonesia's position on the South China Sea, we have to take into account the individual actors and agencies who have their own interests, and it's not just the South China Sea. So for that issue, I think the South China Sea as a whole will always be under prioritized by the Jokowi administration. As far as foreign policy goes, Jokowi will say that we've done all we could. We've helped push the COC process. We have pushed for the Indo-Pacific outlook through ASEAN, and that's it. Beyond that, there's nothing much that will get the administration going. So there's no coherent, there's no consistent strategic response on the South China Sea specifically. It's going to be a lot of bureaucratic response. And that has to do with the president's personal own beliefs that issues that has to do with foreign policy isn't high on his agenda. So you'll see a lot more confusion from Indonesia's response. And I can talk more during the Q&A about each of the different agencies and their agenda, like on maritime policy, how it's actually a lot more driven by our concerns with our regional neighbors rather than China. So for example, in the case of Vietnam. So we can talk more about that on the Q&A. So this is among the key discussions in the current admin about our participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. So these are the proposed ones that we wanted to present to China as far as opportunities goes. As you can see, it has a lot more infrastructure in terms of ports and stuff, but it's less about resources. And the idea is that Indonesia wants our participation in the Belt and Road, not as a government-to-government project, which would burden the budget, but more as a private-to-private enterprise. So the idea of to create a special fund has always been there. Now, whether or not we will actually see it materialize, that's something that's been ongoing. The high-speed rail thing took about 4 or 5 years to actually move forward. So I'm not so convinced that we will see more practical stuff happening soon. But this is the plan that we offered to Beijing. As you can see as well, it kind of overlaps with the existing patterns of investments that we've seen from China so far, which is roughly on the mining and electricity and stuff. So that is going to be the key priority to boost the existing patterns of investment along with the new participation. So what do we see and what do we expect from our participation? I think Jokowi will be legacy shopping a lot in his last term. So infrastructure, economy, and welfare will be key, and whether or not he wants to jeopardize that by challenging China much more publicly it seems unlikely. I think in the past 4 or 5 years, Jokowi has a lot more phone calls with Xi Jinping than any other foreign leader. So I think that's personal rapport that he's building on. And it's clear to us that at least when it comes to the bilateral ties, it's not defined by a single issue. So South China Sea will not define as much as the Belt and Road Initiative will not define the bilateral ties. It's a lot more complicated for domestic reasons because China, I think, is a lot more domestically combustible than China for the key interests at home. And again, I think the key concern with China for Jakarta is more about the conflict or the trade war between U.S. and China that's hindering Jokowi's economic agenda. If you're more interested in more of the in-depth analysis of the economic preparedness from Indonesia, the report from CSIS Jakarta up there will give you a bit of some sense of where things are. And finally, when it comes to the role of the United States, I think given the big picture stuff where Jokowi is much more interested on the economy and much more concerned with the U.S.-China role, I think the idea that the foreign policy a narrative and communication that's coming out of this particular administration is a bit pushing Indonesia to take a stance when it's articulated as, do you vote or to be with a country that breaks the rules-based order, ones that promotes the rules-based order? That kind of forces Jakarta to make a choice, and that's something that we're not particularly happy about. And if there is an element to improve security relationships, it's not just through FONOPS and the provision of arms and equipment. I think the human capital element of the security elements, both on the maritime domain and the military, is still underdeveloped. So I think that's a key element that hasn't been discussed a lot. And then on the econ side, before a lot of the other agenda, whether it's security, politics, or everything else can be restored, I think the economic agenda for Jakarta would be much more important. And if that is restored, I think there's a chance that Jokowi might actually visit the U.S. at some point in his last admin. And with that, I think that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for being brief. You leave us more time for Q&A. We'll make sure we ask you a tough question in return. We'll turn to Greg Poling to talk about the Philippines.
Well, thanks very much, Bonnie, and thank all of you for coming out for the 9th annual South China Sea Conference. I'm pretty sure we promised to solve all of this by number 10, so we've got a lot of work to do in the next 12 months. I'm going to talk a bit about where things stand for the Duterte government in Manila, since the signals that we get in the press, both the Philippine and the international press, can be more than a little confusing when it comes to statements emerging from different parts of the Philippine government. So over the last, let's say, 9 months or so, the Duterte government has come under more significant pressure on the South China Sea than at any point since he came to office in 2016. It's not that there haven't been previous instances in which his outreach policy toward China has clashed with realities on the ground. There's been a number of incidents over the last 3 years where low-level incidents happened in the South China Sea caused him some heartburn, and then disappeared from the press. What's changed is that it has been almost a constant drumbeat of criticism of the administration's South China Sea approach since late last year. And that starts with the situation around Natuna Island, or Pagasa Island, which is the largest of the Philippine-held features in the Spratlys, occupied by about 100 civilians and a small contingent of Philippine military personnel. Now, to explain what happened here, it's important to talk about the reality on the ground for Chinese power projection in the Spratlys. One of the reasons we don't hear about the South China Sea as much in the front page of major Western papers is because Beijing effectively finished island building by 2016. There is no more coral reefs turning into air bases. China finished large-scale infrastructure construction by the end of 2017. And so what we see now are deployments, increases in the number of missile platforms, of troops, but especially of surface ships operating from these facilities. And that is harder to track. It's harder to keep attention on. It feels like it is often a change that is quantitative, but not really qualitative. But if you are a Filipino fisher, or if you're a Vietnamese fisher, the change that you've seen most over, say, the last 2 years is that when you sail out from Palawan or from Luzon, it used to be pretty rare to bump into a Chinese boat. Now you are more or less guaranteed to run into a Chinese vessel. And most of the vessels operating in the Spratlys are not the PLAN, and they're not the China Coast Guard. They're Chinese fishing vessels, at least a majority of whom operate part-time in the Maritime militia. Now, those conclusions come from a 6-month project that AMTI undertook in cooperation with Vulcan, which is an operation out of Seattle that monitors remote sensing technologies to determine vessels at sea. And what we found is that when you look at the Spratly Islands in AIS, which are the signals that all boats are supposed to transmit, there don't seem to be any vessels there. All the gray dots there are the Spratly Islands. There is no boat transmitting at any given time. This is a pretty average month. Now, everybody knows anecdotally that that can't possibly be true. When you look at it in other spectra, the yellow here are infrared images from VIIRS satellites. You see a ton of night fishing going on, none of whom are transmitting AIS. And when you look with the blue, which is radar, you see a whole lot of metal hulls out there that don't seem to be broadcasting. We use these to tip and cue passes of high-resolution optical imagery, and what we found, unsurprisingly, is that the largest numbers of vessels, the constellations, are Chinese ships that operate primarily from Subi Reef and Mischief Reef, the two large harbors that China has built in the Spratlys. This shot is a pretty average day of Subi Reef. There are about 150 boats in that picture. On any given day, there are at least 300 Chinese fishing vessels operating at Subi and Mischief, and a few dozen more clustered around Philippine-held and Vietnamese-held features. We published these findings in January, and it got a bit of press in the region. It caused some heartburn for the Philippine government. But what really hurt them was in February, when the Armed Forces of the Philippines confirmed that these maritime militia had been swarming around Natuna Island. So in December of last year, the Philippines started long-delayed upgrade work at Natuna. They've been planning to fix this decrepit runway for years. They finally started building a beaching ramp so they could bring in heavy supplies. Almost immediately, about the same day that this work started at Natuna, roughly 100 of those boats poured out of Subi Reef, which is just 12.5 miles away, and they dropped anchor between 2 and 5 nautical miles from Natuna. In this photo from December 20th, there are 95 Chinese fishing boats. Every one of them is at anchor. Only one of them is broadcasting AIS. None of them have any nets in the water. None of them are doing any commercial fishing. And they have stayed there for the last 8 months. The numbers go up, they go down. Some days we only see 20. Some days we've seen 85, 90. The Philippine government said, the Philippine Armed Forces said, that in February and March, they monitored 295 individual boats on 600 different occasions around Natuna Island. This has been, because it is so persistent and because it so clearly clashes with the narrative that the Duterte government has put out there about the way that they expected Beijing to react in response to Duterte's policy, it has become a serious headache that does not leave the papers. About a month ago, you had the Philippine Special Envoy to China, Chita Santa Romano, say that he had been assured that the Chinese were pulling these vessels out. A week later, the AFP confirmed that they were still there. And they are still there, in smaller numbers, but they are there constantly. It is not just around C2. We see smaller constellations of Chinese vessels that never appear to be fishing. The only rational explanation one can come up with is that they are militia vessels around pretty much all of the features occupied by the Philippines and Vietnam at one time or another. These are two other Philippine-held outposts north of C2. For all of March and all of April, we monitored at least a dozen boats that were anchoring around the features all the time, never fishing. There are 4 boats in this image down to the southern end there that you can see. They're less than half a nautical mile from the Philippine military outpost. So when things like this happen, and they persist for months at a time, you can imagine the kind of internal pressure from the armed forces of the Philippines and the defense establishment that the palace is probably feeling. It is unsurprising that the armed forces of the Philippines are not thrilled about the idea that they have to pretend this kind of thing isn't happening day in and day out. The second headache for the Duterte government has been a steady stream of bad news about environmental destruction in the reefs of the Philippines EEZ. And most of this emerges from Chinese clam harvesting. So about 3 months ago now, ABS-CBN, the biggest broadcaster in the Philippines, sent a crew out to Scarborough Shoal. And what they found was active Chinese clam harvesting going on across the shoal, which they filmed and broadcast and caused a lot of outrage in the Philippines. This was surprising because we knew that the Chinese had done an enormous amount of clam harvesting from 2012 to about 2016. They destroyed at least 25,000 acres of reef with their clam harvesting. But that had stopped at the end of 2016, largely because Hainan started cracking down on the clam market. The sale of endangered clam is illegal within China. To give you a sense of what happens when you dig for giant clams in the ways that China does, this is a picture of the reef that surrounds C2 Island. It's overfished, but it is still a healthy reef. This is the reef that's 1.5 miles away to the east after the Chinese clam harvesters finished. Once these clam operations finish, there is no more fishing at that reef. And so you can imagine the outrage that emerges from Filipino coastal communities when this happens in reefs that they have been fishing for generations. This is a shot from earlier this year. This is late December. You can see dozens of small Chinese clam boats tied up behind these larger motherships operating around Scarborough for the first time in years. All of the yellow there is new scarring from the clam harvesting that happened over the last few months. This is a shot of that ABS-CBN report I mentioned. And what we found out here is that the clam harvesters from Hainan have developed a whole new method to harvest clams. They were so successful up until 2016 in digging up all of the shallow areas of the South China Sea's reefs that they had to find a way to get to the deeper stuff in the lagoons. And they have adapted a method that's usually seen in maritime salvage operations. So what you see there is a boat with a large water pump on it and 2 hoses. One hose blows water out, creating suction on the other. And then a guy gets into the water in snorkeling gear and just holds it down on the sand like a vacuum cleaner. Just as destructive and lets you dig for clams pretty much anywhere. When the ABS-CBN crew got into the water, this is what they found: a devastated reef and dozens of these massive piles of clams. So that's headache number 2. And headache number 3 that I think's brought all of this to a head has been this incident over the Jember 1. That's a Filipino fishing boat that was struck and sunk off Reed Bank in the Philippine EEZ last month. Now, it is unknown and probably unknowable whether or not the Chinese vessel that struck the Jember 1 was acting part-time in the maritime militia. We know it was hundreds of miles from its home port. It had never been seen in that area before. Its sister ships don't operate there. But all that is speculative. What we do know is that it struck an anchored Philippine boat and left 22 Filipino fishermen to die. Luckily, they were rescued by a Vietnamese boat. And the Duterte government's response was largely to blame the fishermen, blame their own fishermen for that operation, to say that somehow the Filipino fishermen had been negligent, they were making a big deal out of nothing. This has certainly backfired. And so today what we see, President Duterte had to address the issue of fishing in the South China Sea in his State of the Nation address, the big annual equivalent to the State of the Union he gives, for the first time. It has become such a headache that it is now at the center of his public responses to criticism. It's also noticeable that in the latest public opinion polls released this week, trust for China has plummeted from a negative, 6 to over a negative 60. We are at pre-Duterte levels when it comes to the way Filipinos feel about China. So I will just end with saying that this is an area to watch. I don't know. I don't think anybody in the Philippines really knows how malleable the Duterte government is to public opinion. But it is clear that outside of the palace, frustration with the failure of this 3 years of policy to deliver real gains is building. And I seriously doubt whether or not the administration can continue as if that's not the case.
Thank you, Greg. Well, of course, the other area where we have seen recent tensions spike is between China and Vietnam. And this has just started earlier this month, so maybe just in time for our conference. But many are describing this as the largest crisis between China and Vietnam in the South China Sea since China deployed its oil rig in 2014 in Vietnam's EEZ. So although Dr. Huang cannot be with us, as I said, she has prepared a video. Dr. Huang Lei Tu is a senior analyst at ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and if our technology is working well, then we will start that now.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to participate in CSIS Annual South China Sea Conference. I really regret I can't be there in person, but I do send warm regards to all the CSIS colleagues, fellow presenters, and all conference participants. In my short presentation, I will give my view, but those are my views only and not representative of any country or organization. In my view, it has been a state of play where I would call it a continuous and deepening tension with strong underlying concerns, despite some appearances of goodwill and friendly cooperation gestures. So concerns are about the health of the rules-based order in general, but also continuous and scaling up of Beijing's coercion, concerns about increasing numbers of predictive incidents, but also about the health of ASEAN solidarity in general. From Hanoi's perspective, the South China Sea is getting more dangerous for sure and increasingly unstable. Dangerous because of somehow a successful narrative that South China Sea is more stable, more harmonious, and that the claimants are able to solve the issues among themselves without external inputs, something that it is hard for Hanoi to play along with. A number of goodwill gestures or goodwill has been displayed by, demonstrated by, for example, reaching this milestone achievement of arriving at a single zero draft for the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. The Code of Conduct in South China Sea, as we all know, it's been a protracted process, but last August, ASEAN countries and China had arrived at a single draft negotiation text in August 2018, which is still far from reaching any meaningful agreements, but it is already being portrayed as a significant progress. Another apparent sign of positive development between China and Southeast Asian neighbors was, for example, also the first joint multilateral maritime exercises conducted in October 2018. A number of other larger scale, not only regional but global scale diplomatic developments, including, for example, the second Belt and Road Initiative Summit in May in Beijing this year, where most of the ASEAN countries participated in, have created an impression that China is friendlier to its neighbors, and somehow the South China Sea dispute are taking less of prominence in the relationships. More unstable because of fast evolving developments, including the incidents that draw international attention. For example, the current standoff in Vanguard Bank that I will speak about in a minute. But also numerous ones that go under the radar because they're so-called gray zone operations, involving maritime militia operations, and frequent fishermen harassment, and so on and so forth. Last year, at the South China Sea Conference, Bill Hayden analyzed the cases of economic coercion that in which Beijing prevented Vietnam from oil and gas explorations that it did in conjunction with foreign companies like Repsol and Rosneft. This is continued to another level this year, and in particular in the case of the Vanguard Bank standoff. What happened was early July, on the 3rd of July, a Haiyang DG8 vessel, survey vessel owned by the government-run survey corporation, started surveying around the block of 0601 with some accompanied maritime militia vessels as well as Coast Guard vessels. These details of the positions and type of vessels and really movement of them and has been exposed by the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which I also draw my analysis from. So I think for the time constraint, I will skip the details because they're much better presented on the AMTI website. But I will talk about how the respective countries responded thus far to the incident. So since early July, really, there hasn't been much of coverage of the incidents. So most of our knowledge are deriving from either AMTI website or Twitter feed of social media. One of most active and prominent one was from Ryan Martinson from the U.S. Naval War College, who tracked the movement of the vessels. And on the 16th of July, the first response from the Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs was to question about the activities near the block of 0601, in which the spokesperson reiterated Vietnam's sovereign right over the waters and seabed, and noted that relevant Vietnamese authorities have been exercising those rights. In response to that, on the 17th of July, China's Ministries of Foreign Affairs urged Vietnam to, quote, respect China's sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters and do not take any move that may complicate the matters, end quote. Well, to that, Vietnamese Foreign Ministry called China on the 19th of July to immediately end the violation and withdraw all vessels from Vietnamese waters, saying, quote, Chinese survey ships Haiyang DG8 and its escort had over the past few days conducted activities in the southern area of East Sea that violated Vietnam's exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, end quote. Interestingly, on the 20th of July, the U.S. State Department issued a statement saying, quote, the United States is concerned by report of China's interference with oil and gas activities in the South China Sea, including Vietnam's long-standing exploration and production activities. China repeated provocative actions aimed at the offshore oil and gas development of other claimant states, threatened the regional energy security, and undermined a free and open Indo-Pacific energy market, end of quote. So this incident had reached international attention, and the importance of it is still developing as we speak. But it is certainly not only an issue between Vietnam and China at the moment, as China obviously expressed its displeasure from the U.S. statement. So the Vanguard Bank incident has been hailed so far as the most serious since 2014 oil rig crisis, Haiyang Shiyo 891, where Beijing deployed an oil rig into Vietnamese exclusive economic zone as well. That was one of the most serious incidents in between the two countries and have had lasting impact on the bilateral relations, on Vietnam's foreign and defense policy, but also on the larger picture of the development in the South China Sea. But compared to that incident of 2014, the Vanguard Bank incident is relatively lower profile. It didn't have, again, as much domestic attention so far. Only, as I said, started being reported on the 16th of July, and the scale of coverage have wrapped up since then, but only really picked up since around the 20th of July. So right now, in the major media, major newspapers of Vietnam, there feature a couple of articles daily on the topic, but before that really was very scarce resources. And why is that so that this time around the reaction has been different? There are a number of explanations. First of all, one of them is that perhaps an attempt to control the anti-Chinese sentiment in Vietnam, learning the lessons from 2014, where the protests broke out in the major cities in Vietnam, but also turned into a violent protest and included some vandalism and mob activities around the areas of factories belonging to Chinese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Korean, and even our own Vietnamese investors. And Vietnamese government bad consequences of reputational damage of a safe environment, safe investment environment, and also had to pay some compensations for the damages. So this time around, perhaps it is an attempt to cap the potential anti-Chinese sentiment and protests related to that. Something also that Vietnam might have waited and hoped to communicate first with some of its key partners and key partners, and perhaps secure diplomatic support from the U.S. and other actors as well. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vietnam has utilized multiple channels to reach China, but also in between 8th and 12th of July, Vietnamese National Assembly Chairwoman Nguyễn Thị Kim Ngân was in Beijing, where she saw President Xi Jinping among others, and the two parties were set to have common commitment to the peaceful maritime environment, but we do not know if the Vanguard Bank conversation was really happened in details there. Also around before the exposure of the incident, the 13th ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting happened between 10th and 12th of July. But the final joint statement made no mention about the Chinese vessels in Vietnamese EEZ. The only mention about Satana Sea was the hope of peaceful environment and early conclusion of the code of conduct, so pretty standard ASEAN language. For whatever reasons, this time around the reaction is different than 2014. I think it's not the most critical question. The most critical question is what are the new responses that Vietnam and others may have this time around. Because yes, in 2014, the media campaign, both domestic and international, was one of the key pillars of successful counter-coercion response. And actually, really this so-called megaphone diplomacy was credited for a successful deterrence of Beijing's coercion, and the Haiyang Shio withdrew from the Vietnamese waters earlier than planned. This time around, I think the mere media campaign would not be sufficient to repel Beijing, as this coercion is not happening just targeted at Vietnam only, but it is. But Malaysia is facing similar dilemma at the moment as well. So Beijing is scaling up the coercion and is not targeting one at a time, but multiple at a time, and apparently is not very much concerned about the reputational damage it is causing, despite the peaceful and friendly rhetoric it is putting out there. What is interesting this time is the U.S. response that came fairly early and very clear. In that statement that U.S. State Department put it out, there are three very clear components there. That is China's condemning China's action, supporting Vietnam's EEZ rights, but also interestingly refreshing, at least to some, is that this means maybe a departure from Washington's approach of not taking sides, and it's pretty clear in this statement what its position is. I'd be interested in learning more about also.
Okay, again, sorry to cut off Dr. Huang, and I appreciate very much the fact that she did send that video to us from Australia. Before I turn to our next speaker, I just want to say that for all of you who are standing in the back, there are, I think it looks to be about 15 seats at the three tables over here. If anybody would like to, if you want to go around, come in that door and take a seat. We welcome you to do that. So we're now going to turn to...
Bonnie, could you say something about what she said? I couldn't hear anything. I mean, you don't hear either. No. There's a number of us who couldn't hear much. Could you just... What was she talking about?
I think I'm going to have to turn to our next speaker. I don't think it's my role to sort of summarize what she said, but if you want to ask questions during the Q&A, I'm sure that members of our panelists can talk about. She was describing the episode that is ongoing between Vietnam and China that is in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. It is near Vanguard Bank, and so there have been since early July, there has been a survey ship that China has deployed, and you can go on the Twitter feed she mentioned of Ryan Martinson, who has been tracking the survey operations of a particular vessel of China's that is operating in this area inside the exclusive economic zone, what Vietnam says is its exclusive economic zone, which I think would be borne out under the definition of UNCLOS. And so maybe in the presentation that Mr. Liu Xiaobo is about to give us, he can perhaps mention something about how China views this issue, but that is what she talked about. I would also reference, which she did, a very important statement that was made. She read it by the State Department this past Saturday about that incident. So you can look at that statement. That's good enough. Sorry that the volume wasn't adequate. Okay, Liu Xiaobo, over to you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you for CSIS to invite me here. And wow, it's a very great experience. Thank you, Gregory.
A little louder.
Oh,
please.
yeah, sorry.
Yes?
Sorry. Yeah.
Get close to the microphone.
Should I thank you again?
Okay. You don't have to thank me again.
Oh, yes. And my presentation speak is just to represent myself, and I will not represent my institute. And as I had retired from Navy and 2 years, so I will not speak on behalf of the Chinese Navy or something Chinese government, always behalf of myself. And I want to share two points of my view on the freedom of navigation and the militarization of the South China Sea, and it's my personal view. First, when I talked about the dispute and of freedom of navigation between Chinese and China and the U.S., I think and how to interpret the law of the sea, but one of the most prominent is a different perception on the military use of the sea. And I personally think that China did not oppose the maritime order and reflected by the freedom of navigation. And what China opposed is the instability caused by the U.S. FONOPs. And some of the U.S. FONOPs in the South China Sea are meant to challenge the Chinese domestic law, specifically on the which require prior permission for the foreign warship to enter the territorial sea, which is a 1996 Chinese territorial law. And since 2015, and the U.S. Navy have conducted follow-up 17 times, but Chinese policy and stayed unchanged and remained unchanged and constantly tough. And I think if China's law of the territorial sea conflict with our maritime interest, then it is a possibility that China will revise it. But I think under the pressure of the U.S. follow-ups, and this possibility is likely to be suppressed by nationalism in China. And the possible revisions will be interpreted as the Chinese government and showing weakness to the U.S. And for most sea power and the freedom of navigation operations at sea reflected their interests. And in my respect, I extend my thanks to the U.S. Navy because the U.S. Navy defends the interest of maritime powers. And this is certainly a scope of China's future interests. And I personally think that someday in the future, China would also make a similar statement, just like Chinese Navy will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. And when it finds out that it wants the same freedom of navigation than the U.S. has now. When I joined the Chinese Navy as a seaman in 1993, and the Chinese Navy could not enter the top 10 of the world. And the Chinese Navy's strategic goal at that time is maintain the security of the China's coastline and prevent aggression from the sea. At that time, freedom of navigation was not the priority, and the law of the territorial sea was enacted at that time. But nowadays, and I think the Chinese Navy ranks the second sea power of the world. We have 2 aircraft carriers, more than 15 U-types and destroyer and frigates, and more than 16 and ocean-going and nuclear and reefs. Oh, sorry. Compared, sorry, thank you. Compared with controlling the South China Sea, and the safety of the strategic sea line of communication is more important. The South China Sea is only one part of these slogs. And even if China is willing to control the South China Sea, and I don't think China has the ability to control all the straits and the sea lines in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So I think the security concept of cooperation will be precisely a pragmatic policy for China's strategic security of the sea. And when I talk about I can talk the China's intention of militarization, and I would like to say my personal view about the commitment of the President Xi Jinping. And on September 25, 2015, and President Xi Jinping said at the White House, and China does not intend to pursue militarization of Nansha Island in the South China Sea. But just 1 month later, and on October 27th, the USS Larsen had conducted the first follow-ups in the Spratly Island. And another month later, and on October 13th, the US flies 2 B-52 bombers over the Chinese Station Island. And I think this US military operation had provoked Xi and the military leader of the Chinese CMC, and so lead the Chinese military deployment into an irreversible process. Each time when the Ministry of National Defense of Chinese government responds to US follow-ups, and the spokesman repeat, we will take all necessary measures to maintain our own safety. It's not just a verbal slogan. I think that China have taken concrete actions. The United States believes that the follow-up and the military operations will weaken China's military deployment and force China to withdraw its military facility. But the result is that the U.S. follow-up operations has provoked China with enough incentive to increase its military deployment. Because as China irritated that the U.S. follow-ups jeopardize the core interests of the sovereignty and security. About the domestic nationalism, moreover, China's military deployment has also met the emotional venting of the domestic nationalism and consolidated the government ruling foundation. Compared with the pressure of the international public opinion, the domestic effect of militarization is very positive. Now the construction of the island have increased the land area and some facility. The fact is that with the ignition of the U.S. operations, China will speed up military deployment. In my view, the Chinese Navy is still learning from the U.S. Navy. I personally believe that in the future, China will imitate the military deployment of the islands, just like Guam and Diego Garcia. My conclusion is that the U.S. and China really need to review its policy. If the U.S. goal is to pressure China to withdraw its military deployment by demonstrating the U.S. military strength, I think is a mission impossible. Or if U.S. want to prevent China to control the South China Sea by using military strength, but finally, I think it will provoke China to achieve this goal. China should also review its own policy. After all, the security order in the South China Sea will not be determined by China's unilateral policy. The influence of the United States is objectively existing, and the United States cannot be simply defined as an extraterritorial country. And the security order in the South China Sea would depend on the dynamic between China and the US. I think the security concept of the new type of cooperation advocated by China and still need to be concrete implementation. That's all. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've had 4 really terrific presentations, and we now have, I think it is 20 minutes remaining for Q&A. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Please identify yourself. Please be very brief, ask a question so we can get in as many questions as possible. And we will start right over there. Is there a microphone coming? Yes. No, you'll have to wait because this is being webcast live. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. Piotr from CSIS and the country formerly known as the United Kingdom. Essentially under the current...
It still exists.
Well,
No, go
not
ahead.
under the incoming PM. Anyway, my question relates to the wider region because the South China Sea is, incredibly important for countries beyond just that region in question. With Chinese and Russian activity increasing, my query is if they're basically forming quite a strong partnership, how is the United States going to respond to this? These two so-called revisionist states. There's increasing ties with India. Could that be a potential route? What about Japan and South Korea as well? Thank you.
All right, so I think maybe what I'll do is I'll take 3 questions and then we'll let the panelists respond to them. And if you want a particular panelist to answer, then please identify that person. We'll go to this side of the room, this gentleman over here, to the right with the glasses, yes.
So thank you for very excellent panelists on that. I have 2 questions, one for grappling. The first one, we see a series of assertive, also aggressive action on the part of China, not only against Philippines, also Malaysia and Vietnam as well. And recent development that the China will move the survey ship really deep into Vietnam EEZ, and we see that the legal order of the sea will be undermined by this activity. So what is the driver for this series of type of assertive and also aggressive action on the part of China? And the second one to Liu Xiaobo. I mean, the thing in the South China Sea often described from the action-reaction cycle, but how you perceive it from the international point of view? Because you perceive the legal and lawful activity of other countries as a trigger. So you lose the sense about how the law that allow the activities there. So how you perceive, the rights and interests of other smaller countries in the region. Thank you.
Okay, and we're going to take one more. We'll take one right here from this woman. Yes. Please identify yourself. Go ahead.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Sarah Kirchberger from Kiel in Germany.
Yes.
And my question is for Ivan Lakshmana. If I understood you correctly, it sounded as if Indonesia doesn't consider itself to be in any way involved in the sovereignty disputes and not so much a state that is in any sort of conflict with Chinese behavior. So my question would be, what about the Natuna Islands? It seemed, I'm not an expert on that, but it seemed that Indonesia has been a bit nervous about possible Chinese ideas of looking into the Natuna issue and has stepped up its fortifications of the Natuna Islands. So what's your view on that? And related also to that, what about the policy of Indonesia of sinking and filming the sinking of fishing vessels that operate illegally in Indonesian waters? Have there been any incidents involving Chinese fishing vessels? Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll start with you, Evan. You want to respond to those questions?
Sure. Really quickly, on the first question about the regional environment and the regional powers, I think it's clear for a lot of regional policymakers that the environment is deteriorating. But I think the domestic realities of each of these countries in the region, I think, necessitates that they put more priority on domestic stuff, especially with regards to the economy. So the appetite for geopoliticking isn't as high across the region as we would like. So no matter how much the military or civil society groups are trying to push a much more regionally driven engagement, I think the pressures of domestic politics is still high, not to mention the fact that transnational threats like terrorism is also still high on the agenda. So if the regional environment is getting worse, I think it won't necessitate a much more focused response from the regional countries. I think the response will still be quite muddied. On the part about the non-claimant position, and this relates a little bit about with the first questions with regards to the regional environment, I think the position from Jakarta has always been that with the Natuna, there is no dispute with China, because up until today, every time we try to ask China, what is it exactly that you're claiming and where, we never get a response. So we don't really know what they're claiming other than some vague idea of what the Nan-Dash line was. And I said was because with the PCA ruling, it's null anyway. So our position has always been, as long as there's no specific claim, what are we to negotiate? And right now, Indonesia officially does not recognize any disputed parts with regards to the EEZ. Now, of course, the issue has to do with maritime law enforcement, which I think in Jakarta's mind is a law enforcement problem of our EEZ rather than a dispute over which part belongs to China and which part belongs to us. We obviously don't recognize the idea of traditional fishing rights, but our problem is that we also have a very unilateral and strong interpretation of what we believe to be ours, and hence that's our problem with Vietnam and other countries. And I think Jakarta's response has always been that if the South China Sea is a key issue of regional order, then the solution has always been multilateralism, and this is why I think ASEAN has always been sort of the go-to response. And when it comes to China, I think a stronger response on the maritime domain is further complicated by the fact that we don't have a single Coast Guard, so a stronger response might sometimes come from the fisheries, their own a task force and their own version of a Coast Guard, and sometimes with the Navy it's less of a stronger response. So it depends on who gets to patrol at that particular point in time. So that's why you see sometimes some inconsistencies in how we respond. And with regards to the sinking of the fishing vessel, again, this is the interpretation of the Maritime ministry and not necessarily the foreign ministry. So the foreign ministry's position has always been that in the disputed parts, so let's say there's a disputed part between us and Vietnam, and if there's an incident, we don't really solve it by arresting them and sinking the fishing ships. But the problem is that we take a sweeping view of any ship that falls within what we claim to be our fishing waters, to be falling under our jurisdiction. So when we try to provide a deterrent effect, and we can debate about whether or not it creates the intended effect, but the idea of creating the deterrent effect is by blowing them up. And unfortunately, we thought it was going to last for just the first year, but it has continued on till today. And it's the only way that they can have enough political backing domestically to pursue more expansive agenda for fishing reform. So it's unfortunately that's been the case. Thank you.
Greg?
So, why now? Why has China decided to behave this aggressively toward Vietnamese oil and gas operations? Part of the answer is simply that it can, right? The construction of military facilities in the Spratlys has allowed Beijing to forward deploy and replenish ships in a way it couldn't until just a few years ago. It can now maintain both Navy and Coast Guard, but also militia presence 24/7 throughout the entire 9-dash line. And so it is able to persistently harass these kinds of operations in a way that would have been impossible in 2015. More proximately, while we talk about the survey activity because it's easy to track and because there's so many vessels, half a dozen at least from each side out there, it raises the risk of escalation if somebody bumps into each other. But I think we're putting the cart before the horse. It seems to me the reason that China has engaged in this survey is because of its anger over the Vietnamese drilling operations at Vanguard Bank. So last month, Rosneft began drilling on a new production well in Block 6-1 at Vanguard Bank, despite China having made very clear to Rosneft and Vietnam last year that that would be unacceptable. The same Coast Guard ship that's harassing the Rosneft rig at 6-1 now was harassing a Malaysian rig off the coast of Malaysian Borneo in May. In both cases, it becomes clear that China has decided that now is the time when it can firmly say no new production. It will allow Southeast Asian claimants to continue to produce in existing wells, but just as we saw with it threatening force against Vietnam over the Repsol drilling in July 2017 and again in 2018, it is now making clear that it will not accept new production wells. The other lesson, though, is that it's going to continue to use non-military means to do that. It is Coast Guard and maritime militia. It is trying to get in the way of survey vessels. It is harassing the operations, but it is not actually using force. And what we've seen with Malaysia is that the Malaysians didn't back down and the Chinese seem to have left. In the case of Vietnam, that rig has been operating for a month now. It will probably be done its work in a few weeks, at which point presumably the Chinese will again leave. These operations bring a certain amount of risk, obviously, but what we are seeing, I think, is that Beijing is still not willing to use force. It is trusting in threats and intimidation to convince the Vietnamese and the Malaysians and the Filipinos that there is no point trying to operate in their EEZs. And that will become more and more effective as more and more Chinese ships operate out there 24/7. I'll just touch quickly on, I'm not going to discuss broad Russo-Chinese partnership in the Asia-Pacific. That's a whole other conference. But, you know, it's interesting to me that at the same time that China is harassing a Rosneft drilling operation off the coast of Vietnam, Russia and China are launching a joint military exercise over the East China Sea and Yellow Sea. It seems that Moscow is quite happy to hive the South China Sea off of its broader cooperation with China in the Indo-Pacific. Russia's position on the South China Sea is complicated. Yes, it wants to poke the West in the eye over maritime law, but at the same time, it values its relationship with Vietnam. And so it is not willing to publicly line up with China on this issue. Pretty much every other issue it's happy to, but I think it will remain on the margins of the South China Sea for the foreseeable future.
Okay, great. Finally, Xiaobo, I think the question to you is about the interests of other countries and whether they matter.
Oh, yeah. I will respond to your question about the international order. And I think the core issue of the South China Sea issue is the territorial dispute of the island and reefs and the jurisdiction dispute of the maritime zones in the South China Sea. Until right now, what I have presented in the freedom of navigation and the militarization is nothing about the dispute of the territorial and the jurisdiction. Until right now, I think the Chinese policy just suspended this dispute of the territory and the jurisdiction and to seek the way and try to solve this dispute by negotiation and the peaceful way. Definitely it's true, and until right now, I don't think China have intention to use the force right now. So you have talked, you asked me the international order and Chinese seeking and what's the Chinese view on the international order in the South China Sea. I think the Chinese policy have answered your question. It's very clear. Yeah, that's my view.
All right, we're going to take one last round of 3 questions, and please each person limit yourself to 1 question so that we can get them all answered here. All right, we'll take this woman up front. Sorry, I forgot your name.
Thank you. Si Yang, reporter from The Voice of America. We know the Philippine President Duterte said on Monday, I think, he said China is in the possession or control of the waters in the South China Sea. So he cannot drive China away. And Mr. Poland just mentioned that. Why China acts so aggressively? Because China can. So my question, is China really in control of the South China Sea? And if that is the case, what the United States and its allies can do? Thank you.
Okay. We'll go over here. Bill Hayden.
Thank you very much. My question is to Captain Liu. At the very beginning of your talk, I think you said, if Chinese law conflicts with international obligations, we will, on freedom of navigation, we will change Chinese domestic law. But you're saying if the US continues with FONOPS, this will create nationalism and China won't change the law. Was that what you were saying? In which case, how do you get out of the conundrum? You're saying you're prepared to change the law, but only if the US doesn't sail through the South China Sea. But the US wants to sail through the South China Sea to point out that your law is incompatible with international obligations. How do you resolve that?
Okay, and lastly, yes. Wait for the microphone, please, up front.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. A question for Greg. In the Philippines, the press is very lively and very critical of the government. And the Senate tends to be very critical of the government, too. How are they reacting to all of these issues involving China ramming vessels, et cetera?
Okay, Greg, you want to start?
Sure. So, is China in control of the South China Sea? No, apparently not. The Malaysians decided in May that China's not in control of the South China Sea. Vietnam is asserting right now that China's not in control of the South China Sea. China may or may not be in control of large parts of the Philippine EEZ, but that's only because Manila has decided it's willing to allow China to be in control of large parts of the Philippine EEZ. Beijing it does seem that Beijing's goal is to effectively control the water and airspace of the South China Sea in peacetime. That is the goal of these artificial islands. That is the goal of historic rights throughout the Nine-Dash Line. If that's the goal, it hasn't been accomplished. Nobody, with the possible exception of the current resident of Malacanang in the Philippines, has agreed that China has historic rights throughout the Nine-Dash Line or controls the South China Sea. But China's ability to do that, to make that reality, is growing. And so China is far more in control now than it was 5 years ago, and if U.S. policy doesn't change, and if the policy of most of the claimants doesn't change, China will be in far more control a few years from now. I don't know exactly when we decide that we've lost, if it's 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, but if things don't change, we will inevitably come to the conclusion that Chinese control is a fait accompli. And then on public and press opinion in the Philippines, yeah, you're right. The Philippine press, with the exception of maybe one major paper that I can think of that I won't name, is broadly critical of the Duterte government's policy on the South China Sea. Public opinion is extremely critical of the Duterte government's opinion on the South China Sea. I mentioned the abysmal numbers for trust in China, which have been plummeting all through this year from an already low position. Over 90% of Filipinos in polls say that the government should assert its claims in the South China Sea. Over 80% support the U.S. alliance. Over 70% support a forward-deployed U.S. military presence in the Philippines. None of these are consistent with Duterte government policy. But, just as with the U.S. and every other country, Filipino citizens don't generally vote based on foreign policy. And so to date, the government has been relatively immune from the effects of anger over its foreign policy. There have been, individual cabinet members have been scapegoated. There has been changes below the radar, right? So the armed forces and the Department of National Defense, for instance, have been allowed to get the U.S. alliance back on track. We're doing the same number or more of exercises, of visits than we were before Duterte. We've just had the bilateral strategic dialogue last week, in which we've, I think, set the groundwork to see the alliance grow tighter, but all of that has to happen below Duterte's attention. As I said at the end of my talk, I don't know how much Duterte can be moved by public opinion. He has been remarkably unmovable to date, although I do think he's found the outer limits of what's politically acceptable, right? He has found kind of where the cliffs are and stepped back from them. If he keeps operating in this space, I suspect that unless the next time the Chinese ram a Filipino boat, the 22 fishermen die, he probably doesn't move off this position.
Okay, the last word to you.
Yeah, I will respond to the items and the question about the territorial sea revision, and it's all my personal view and about that revision. And I think this revision may be fit for our Chinese interest right now. And when the Chinese enacted that law of the territorial sea in 1990s, at that time, and the priority is not the freedom of navigation in China. So the protect the coastline, protect the territorial sea, maybe the strategic goal in China in 1990s. Right now, and I think when the Chinese have a very strong navy and just on ocean going, so we think maybe this revision will reflect our interests. It's also all my personal view, and I don't think it have a very relation between Chinese revision and the international obligation. I don't think so. There's only a domestic law and a domestic right, and we have the many countries and the world have revision his domestic law to fit his domestic interests, just like in 1888 and the Black Sea collision, and the Soviet Union had changed the domestic law about the foreign warships and to enter territory, so request the permission. And there are many states in the world, and just Sweden, and changed the law about that, about the foreign territory, foreign warship to enter territorial sea. And even the Vietnam have changed that, and to the foreign to prior permission, and change to the prior notification. And just like the South Korea is the same, and the Indonesia, just I know, and yeah. But right now, it also my personal view. I don't think we will change very fast. Maybe just my thinking, yeah.
All right, great. This has been a terrific first session. I'm sorry I didn't get to the questions of many of you, but we do have the rest of the day. You'll have many of opportunities to ask your questions later on. We do not have a break at this particular moment, so I'm going to ask you all, if you can, to stay in your seats. We have a very long, extended break for lunch, but we're going to quickly swap out our panelists. We're going to move to our next session, which is on history and historiography. How did we get here? So please join me in thanking all of our panelists.
Settle back down in your seats. Sorry, we don't have a coffee break scheduled because we do have a long lunch break coming up. But we're going to go right into our next panel in just a moment as a few people settle into their seats. We wanted this year to have a panel that took a step back from the current understanding of the conflicts and take a look at the origins, take a look at how different countries and players have viewed their historical rights and have viewed their understanding of the territories and the issues over time. So we've put together a really terrific panel that will take a look at history and historiography from different perspectives. I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we'll just sort of go down the line with their presentations. All the way to my right, we have Bill Hayton, who's an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House and has worked as a journalist for BBC since 1998. And he has focused a lot of his work on South China Sea disputes and current affairs in Southeast Asia. And he will be sharing a lot of his work and his thoughts with us today. Next, we have Stein Tonnessen. Dr. Tonnessen is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. His research mainly focuses on Vietnam, nation building in Southeast Asia, and disputes in the South China Sea. And he leads a research program at the University of Uppsala on the East Asia Peace, and is a regular contributor to the Norwegian weekly Morgenbladet. Then we have Maritas Vitug, who's the editor-at-large of Rappler, and prior to that, she edited Newsbreak magazine, and she has authored a book called Shadow of Doubt: Probing the Supreme Court, which has exposed critical weaknesses in the Philippines High Court. And she has, her recent book called Rock Solid looks at the Philippines maritime dispute with China, and she's going to share with us how that unfolded through the arbitral tribunal process. And then finally we have Kawi Chongkitavorn, who's a senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University and is a columnist for the Bangkok Post. His research focuses on U.S. foreign policy towards Southeast Asia, especially with Thailand, the future of the Indo-Pacific, and the regional security architecture. And he has done a lot of work on looking at ASEAN, and he's going to share with us a view of the way that ASEAN has dealt with these disputes with China over time and the current discussions under the Code of Conduct. So with that, let me turn it over to Bill.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back here, and it's great to see a full room for people who want to learn about history. Fantastic. Why should we care about the history? Well, I think the reason is that there are ways of looking at the South China Sea which tend to prioritize a Chinese point of view, and that's partly because the first people out of the blocks to write about the history of the South China Sea generally came from a Chinese background, as in literally, citizens of the PRC or the Republic of China, and that has skewed a lot of the interpretation and the writing of history ever since. But I think that it's very important because, as we heard from Captain Liu, he was talking about China's core interests and territory as being part of it. So therefore, when we see China behaving in certain ways in the South China Sea, it's predicated upon this view of the rightfulness of China's territorial claim, this sense of entitlement to all the rocks and reefs that lie within the U-shaped line. And if other players in the South China Sea only talk about freedom of navigation or exclusive economic zones and miss the underlying territorial dispute, they're going to fail to understand what is driving China's actions, and you will end up with a collision. We need to therefore address this problem. So, for example, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June this year, you saw the Chinese Minister of Defense saying that China has never invaded another country, forgetting, of course, 1974 when it invaded the Paracel Islands, 1988 when it fought over the Spratly Islands, plus, of course, the 1979 border war with Vietnam and India and so on. So the only way that this view can make sense is if you accept a Chinese point of view that all of these bits of territory rightfully belong to China, and it was the other countries that were violating China's sovereignty. That's the only way that that statement can make sense. So if you need to understand that position, I think, to understand this sense of righteousness that lies behind a lot of China's actions. The result is this ridiculous situation that what you're looking at in that picture is officially the southernmost point of Chinese territory. And what you'll notice is there isn't actually any territory there. It's a screw-up, which came from the 1930s, which I will try to explain shortly. The Zhengmu Ansha. And as a little clue, you need to understand that Zhengmu is simply the Chinese transliteration of the word James, J-M, Zhengmu. Yeah? It's nonsense. If you really want to deep dive into this nonsense history and how a lot of the bad writing that has emerged in the academic literature since the 1970s, I really recommend this paper by Johannes Kurtz, a German scholar at the University of Brunei, who has really been through a lot of the original classical Chinese documents to see whether they actually say the things which advocates of the Chinese claim say they do. And surprise, surprise, he finds out that sentences have been twisted, translations have been distorted, words have been inserted in order to make Chinese claims look solid. When you go back and look at the original classical Chinese texts, words like South China Sea are not there, words like foreigner have been omitted, and so on and so forth. I really recommend this. I'm happy to share this, this piece of work with anybody. It's also on my Twitter feed if you want to download it. It all kicks off really in the South China Sea, not until 1909, and the motivation was guano, bird poo. A Japanese guano entrepreneur lands on Pratas Island, known in Chinese as Dongsha, and it's only when William Taft later president of this country, happens to pay a visit to Shanghai in 1907, that he brings this to the attention of the Chinese authorities. And that's really when Chinese interest in the South China Sea first takes off. But it does take them a very long time to respond, well over a year, suggesting that at that time offshore islands were far from being a primary concern of the Qing authorities. It's at the same time that an expedition is launched to the Paracel Islands in 1909, a three-day expedition, upon which all the subsequent claims in the South China Sea really hang. Nothing really much happens for at least a decade after that. I'm going to skip out a lot for time reasons. But it's really, France makes a claim to the Paracel Islands in 1931 and ends up in a diplomatic dispute with China. And while that dispute about the Paracels is still raging, France makes a separate claim to the Spratly Islands on Bastille Day of 1933, 14th of July, and which is then published in the newspapers here. And what is very clear from the very beginning is that the Republic of China government has no idea where the Spratly Islands actually are, and confuses them with the Paracel Islands. And you can see that in this telegram here, which is a Republic of China telegram from the Foreign Ministry, from the Navy to the Foreign Ministry, in which the Navy says, I don't know what you're talking about, there are no islands there. This is 1933, okay? And these are the islands which have been sacred to Chinese territory since ancient times, if you believe the current day propaganda. And here we have proof that they didn't know where they were. In fact, it was only in 1933 when the Chinese consul in Manila went to see the American colonial authorities there and asked them for a map that the Republic of China learnt that the Spratlys and the Paracels were in fact in different places. So what then happened was that the Republic of China went about a process of creating knowledge, trying to devise Chinese names for the features in the South China Sea. And we know that they simply copied a British list. This list here, the 1906 China Sea Directory. We know this because there are mistakes in the Chinese list, and the only other document which has exactly the same list of mistakes is this document which I put on the screen there, the South China Sea Directory of 1906. Now this committee holds various meetings, 25 meetings between June 33 and late 1934, and agrees these Chinese names. And the first version of all these names are simply the translations or transliterations of the English or the names which are found on British maps. Hence, James becomes Zhengmu and so forth. And ironically, some of those are still in use today. So, for example, in the Paracel Islands, in Chinese, Jinyindao, Money Island, is named after William Money, who was a British imperialist manager of the East India Company. Linyanjiao, Antelope Reef, is named after a ship of the East India Company which surveyed it, and still to this day known by those names in Chinese. And then along comes an entrepreneurial retired geography professor by the name of Bai Mei Chu, who makes his own atlas based upon these names. And he adds some innovations, notably a whole number of islands which don't actually exist, as you'll see from this map. So there's the James Shoal. It doesn't exist, but it's drawn as an island. There's the Vanguard Bank. Doesn't exist, drawn as an island. This is Seahorse Shoal, and the names are simply the translations of the British names. Why is this important? Well, this is where the Philippines wants to develop gas on the Reed Bank. This is where Malaysia has just been threatened by Chinese Coast Guard ships. This is where Vietnam is currently being threatened by Chinese Coast Guard ships. Okay? The history is alive now. The only reason that this line was drawn in the way it was because this man, who was not a very good geography professor, drew this line on this map back in 1936 around these non-existent features. Okay? That's why we're in conflict today. That's why South China, Southeast Asian governments are having these problems right now. Why did he do that? I think it's because he copied this good map, drawn by a British man, of course. Okay, and you see, James Shoal, Vanguard Bank, Seahorse Bank are drawn as little dotted lines, as in they are not above the water. Bai Mei Chu just went and coloured them in and called them islands, and became the southern part of the Chinese territory. And then 2 of his students, these 2 guys here, were hired by the Republic of China Ministry of the Interior straight after the Second World War in 1946, and they took his map. In fact, the very first map that was officially drawn by the Republic of China government in 1946, which has a 9-dash line, it's called the location sketch map, has exactly the same features marked on it: Seahorse Bank, James Shoal, and Vanguard Bank. And this was drawn by the guy on the left here. And then he also goes down to the Spratlys in 1946 on the claiming expedition. The very first time, December 46, that any Chinese official ever landed on the Spratly Islands. And you can see this even in official Chinese publications. This is the Republic of China's official handbook. The first edition, published in 1943, says the southernmost point of territory is the Paracel Islands, as you can see up there. But the second edition, published 4 years later, the Chinese territory has expanded 600 miles south to include what were then called the Tuansha Islands, which are now known in Chinese as the Nansha, the Spratly Islands. So in that 4 critical years between 43 and 47, that's when China claimed the Spratly Islands for the first time. As I've said this before, the Chinese claim to the Spratly Islands is younger than my parents. And then this finally is the map that was published in early 1948, and you can see some of the names are still there. Some of the names were changed to make them sound more Chinese at this point. So, for example, Luconia Shoals, which was initially Lo Kang Nia, transliteration, simply becomes Kang. Lo Kang Nia, they just take the word Kang, which means health, but its derivation is from the English. Here's the solution. So if the International Court of Justice can decide that the Pedro Branca in the foreground belongs to Singapore and Middle Rocks in the background there belongs to Malaysia, then it should be entirely possible to divide up the various rocks and reefs of the South China Sea on similar grounds. Who actually has the right who can demonstrate occupation and administration? Standard, classic international law arguments. Yeah? Uti posseditis, ita possediatis, the Latin, as you possess, so you shall possess. So the question really, how do we get this? And I think there's a critical role here for Taiwan. Taiwan has the archives. Taiwan has a political atmosphere where you can have a discussion and a debate. All of the archives to do with the occupation of the South China Sea features are in Taipei. Taiwan, I think, has what really could be a nuclear option. It could completely destroy the PRC's claim to areas of sea, to islands that were never occupied or administered, simply by making clear what's in its archives. The PRC will presumably be extremely unhappy about this and try to impose costs on Taiwan for doing so. So the question is, what would other claimants, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, be willing to offer to Taiwan to ameliorate those costs? Yeah, I think this is a critical role for the future of the South China Sea, and I think Taiwan could play a very central role in it. But I think China more important than your concern? So is your nationalist concern about your Chinese identity more important than your practical security concern that by legitimizing PRC occupations in the Spratlys that you are facilitating the encirclement of Taiwan, by filling in the strategic space to the south and west of Taiwan? Is that more important to you than your nationalistic one China position? So I think this is a choice really that Taiwan has to make, and is a choice with profound internal and external consequences. But I really think it's a way that we can make clear the partial nature of the various claims in the South China Sea. The fact that they can be, in my view, divided up by asking states to prove actual occupation rather than making blanket statements based on out-of-date and inaccurate maps. We can actually find a way forward to resolve the South China Sea territorial disputes. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Dr. Tonneson?
No, thank you. It's me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think you might need that. Excuse me, Doctor. The regular microphone should be working.
Okay. Can we leave the microphone here in case
Sure.
it conks out?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
As a historian, I would warn against history. Actually, all ancient or modern or pre-modern history, I would argue that the critical dates for deciding sovereignty to islands in the South China Sea are fairly recent. The definition of a critical date you can see here, and it requires that all material facts have been put in place. It's said by legal scholars that the critical date should neither be too early nor too late. But the parties, the relevant parties, must have been given a chance to mark their points, make their claims. The first possible critical date that I can see is 1909, and that is valid for the paracels. Because for a long time in the 19th century, Vietnam had made claims to the paracels. China got there through an expedition in 1909, so that could alter things, so it might be a critical date. But I think it's still much too early, because Vietnam's interests were very badly defended by France after French colonization. France was actually, like Britain and also Japan, interested in seeing the paracels being under Chinese sovereignty, because China was so weak, so they believed that if China controlled the paracels, they could themselves make use of it if time be. So for this reason, France did very little to promote the interests of Vietnam in the paracels. In 1933, which was referred to by Bill Hayton, France proclaimed that it had occupied 6 named islands in the Spratly group. You see the NA up there because at first I wrote 9, but it's actually, when I also looked at the Journal Officiel, it's 6. One important thing here is that France made this acquisition on behalf of itself, not on behalf of Vietnam. While the paracels were considered by the French to be either under Chinese sovereignty or under Annamese, that is Vietnamese sovereignty, the Spratlys were taken by France on behalf of itself. The only real protest that came from Japan. And what changed things in the 1930s and made France finally decide to promote the Vietnamese interest in the paracels was the Japanese threat. They wanted to defend it against Japan. Japan and France then kept a common, they were both present in the paracels until March 1945, when the French were driven out by Japan. But 1933, not a good critical date either. 1947, a much better critical date for the paracels, because there was then a race between China and France for occupying the paracels in late 1946. France came too late. When they arrived in January 47, Chinese fleet and garrison was already there in Woody Island. The result was that France established itself in Pattle Island of the Crescent Group, while leaving the Amphitrite Group to China. So if it were to be decided on the basis of 1947, it might well be said that the paracel should be divided between China and Vietnam, and this was actually a division that lasted until 1974. 1951-52 could have been a critical date if the San Francisco Conference had managed to resolve the issue. China was keen to get recognition that Japan surrendered the Spratly and Paracel Islands to China, but neither the Republic of China nor the People's Republic of China were invited to the San Francisco conference. So the PRC had to be defended by the Soviet Union, which tried to get recognition of Chinese sovereignty to the Spratlys and the Paracels. None of the other countries wanted that. The UK wanted to keep its own claim and did not want anything to be said about who should have the Spratly Islands. France also wanted to keep its own claim and did not really sympathize with the new state of Vietnam's demand for sovereignty to it. And the result was that this was left completely open. Then the Republic of China contacted Japan and negotiated a peace treaty of its own in the following year, 1952, where seemingly Japan conceded that the Spratlys and Paracels were ceded to China. The French discovered this and then sought diplomatic contact with Japan and got Japan to confirm that the agreement they had made with Taiwan in no way had changed the status that was in the San Francisco Treaty. So for this reason, the San Francisco Conference did not resolve anything. Then we get to the first real critical date that could be chosen for the Spratlys. And the catalyst here was the proclamation of a Philippine freedom land by the Cloma brothers and backed up by the Vice President of the Philippines, but not official Philippines policy. And this led to a stream of claims from all the relevant countries at that time in a kind of diplomatic exchange that would be ideal for resolving issues. But still, the problem was that there were still countries that were not represented in this, and that's Malaysia and Brunei. So I would recommend against that too. When we get to 1973-75, we get a number of issues that bring things up, and you get, from this stage, a series of occupations. The beginning of occupation. China takes control of the second part of the Paracels through force, and by using force, it makes an invalid sovereignty claim. You cannot gain sovereignty through conquest after the UN Charter of 1945. So 1973-75 brings a lot of change, but still I find it difficult to resolve the Spratly issue for these reasons. One problem that was resolved now was Vietnam's unification. Since 1976, Vietnam has been able to act as one unit, but China has not. So China and Taiwan are both representing one China's interests, but are not coordinating their policies much. A number of things happened in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s that for several reasons do not really make it into critical dates. But my best candidate, tentatively, is 2009, where you had the submission deadline for extended continental shelf claims and where China finally officialized its U-shaped line and also explained it in a short text in an official letter to the UN. This led to a lot of claims and counterclaims and reactions and protests from the countries around, and now also Malaysia and Brunei were part of it, and the Philippines had officialized its claims before that, so all the relevant parties were there. So if I were on an arbitral tribunal or a court, I think I would go for 2009 as the critical date. I was asked to say something here about Vietnam's claims, and I see several weaknesses also in the Vietnamese claims of similar kinds to what Bill Hayton pointed out in the Chinese one. The first is I find it unconvincing that the Nguyen dynasty's claims in the 19th century included the Spratlys. I think it was only about the Paracels, and the court of the Nguyen dynasty used maps that were clearly copying old European maps, placing the Paracels in a very wrong position and making it much bigger than they actually are. Then you see the other weaknesses is that France did such a bad job for its protected colony. And even after Vietnam had been given independence, France continued to claim the Spratlys for itself. I have seen no evidence, although this is repeated in all kinds of statements from Vietnam, that France ever ceded the Spratlys to Vietnam. So there is not the case for cession, which is one of the criteria that you can use for gaining sovereignty. And then there is the problem that North Vietnam, or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, failed to protest a new Chinese law in 1958 that mentioned the Spratlys and the paracels and as under Chinese sovereignty. This may have stopped, that's the term, Vietnam's claims, but there are arguments that can be used by Vietnam also to counter that. Then for the Scarborough Shoal, my suggestion for a critical date is simply 2012, because there had long been a condition where the Philippines was seen to control them. Now there was a change where China took over through an operation using swarms of boats, but not direct provoking armed force. That's the year that you could resolve who had the best claim to sovereignty before that. But still you have impediments that I mention here, and here I think I should end. 10 minutes have gone, I believe.
We can perhaps address some of these in the Q&A session. Let's move to Maritime.
Thank you for the big picture to my two colleagues. I'll tell you a bit of the Philippine story and the Philippine claims. So the Philippines actually began occupying some of the features in the 1960s under President Ferdinand Marcos, who ordered a clandestine mission of soldiers who reported directly to him to occupy certain features. So they began in 1968 to 1971. That's the first wave. And then this included preparations for the takeover. And then the second wave, 1977 to 1980. And the last came in 1999, which was under President Joseph Estrada, who only had ruled for a year and a half. And we knew little that he ordered the occupation of the last feature. And this was done by running a ship aground near Ayungin Shoal or Second Thomas Shoal. And it was a deliberate move by the Philippine Navy. And the ship still stands there today, but it represents the Philippine government because it continues to be in the list of commissioned ships. So during all this time, when I was doing my book, in my research, all of the Navy officers and soldiers whom I interviewed said they never saw a single Chinese soul in all these waves of occupation. And it was only much later, as discussed, that China started to protest these actions of the Philippines. And Marcos issued 2 decrees which declared this area part of the Philippine territory and called it Kalayaan Island. Kalayaan means freedom, and became part of Palawan province. The other decree established the Philippines EEZ, which extended 200 nautical miles from the baselines. Today, this was shown earlier, this is the runway of Tito Island, Pag-asa, which is undergoing repair as informed by the Department of National Defense. And I visited this during my research for the book. And as of 2015, we have only a sprinkling of a few Filipino soldiers guarding this island. And here it's like an open-air museum. This was built in the 1970s under Marcos. And it's no longer used as, today. And we also have the amphibious assault weapon, also unused. And this is a secret of Tito or Pag-asa, if it could be developed into, as some government officials say, into a resort. It could rival those of Malaysia also. And this is the civilians. There are only about 300 civilians in Tito or Pag-asa, and their subsistence is under-subsidized living there because it's very difficult to plant, but they get a lot of fish. So timeline, just a short timeline which showed China's creeping occupation of these parts. So 1988 was when the Philippines recorded occupation of some reefs. 1995 is major because China grabbed appropriately named Mischief Reef. It's Panganiban Reef in the Philippines. And the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative shows current slides, images of this. It has metamorphosed into a base of China. In 2004-2005 was the Philippines and China under Gloria Arroyo entered into a joint marine seismic undertaking. Vietnam protested, so it became a trilateral agreement. Till today, this is being questioned in the Philippine Supreme Court, and there has been no decision yet, more than 10 years ago. I mean, the case was filed more than 10 years. And the next timeline, I also mentioned earlier, was 2011, China stopped the Philippines from exploring for oil and gas in Reed Bank or Recto Bank. And 2012, this was when China took over Scarborough Shoal after 2 months of tense standoff over fishing rights. And then 2013 and 2014, China attempted to prevent Philippine ships from delivering supplies to Second Thomas Shoal. So 2011 and 2012 were crucial in the decision of President Aquino to pursue arbitration against China before the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So when he was making the decision, a number of people openly opposed it, saying it would do more harm to the Philippines, to our relations with China rather than good. So Aquino reflected on this, but 2011 and 2012 have left their imprint on him, and he said that in an interview, he said that he remembers what one ASEAN senior leader said, that there are big countries and there are small countries. That's the way of the world. And he said that there should be an equalizer, which is the rule of law. And that was his anchor when he decided to take China to court with the approval of two past presidents, cabinet, and leaders of Congress. And I think this will be discussed later, but the Philippines did not consult with its ASEAN neighbors because it wanted to keep this a secret for fear that China would learn about it from some of our neighbors. So anyway, January 13 was when the case began, mainly to show that the 9-dash line was illegal, and which Bill Hayton actually showed in his book, and to define the status of the features of in some features in South China Sea. So it was quite an impressive submission of the Philippines, 3,000 plus pages of text. First time that the Philippines made public confidential documents submitted by reports of the Philippine Navy, Philippine Armed Forces, confidential communications between Beijing and Manila, all about the dispute over South China Sea for almost 20 years. So quite impressive submissions of the Philippines to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And for someone like me, a journalist who's skeptical about governments, I was quite impressed with the amount of research. The submissions included maps. More than 600 maps were submitted as part of the Philippine case. And just to briefly introduce you to the main characters in this epic case, former Foreign Affairs Secretary Del Rosario, who presided over this. And this is the lawyer who headed the team of the Philippines. He's from Foley Hoag, based here in DC. He has won similar cases of smaller countries against bigger countries. And this is the Supreme Court Justice. It was his idea to pursue arbitration. And these are the judges who decided the case. Took them 3 years. They're all men. But it was a unanimous decision. They hailed from different parts of the world, and it took them more than 3 years to resolve the case. And this is where the hearings were held. It's the biggest hall in the Peace Palace. And as you can see, the other side is empty because China refused to participate in the case. The Philippines won. It was a stunning victory. We were supposed to celebrate this in July 2016, but we had a different president, so the story changed. And apart from declaring the 9-dash line illegal, the Philippines earlier said that if the Philippines just won this point of the 9-dash line being claimed as illegal, then it would have been a great victory. But apart from that, we also learned that, of course, the 9-dash line was the greatest fake news at the time. We also won the other arguments, like none of the Philippines' entitlements were overlapped by any of China. So it gives exclusive enjoyment of these resources to the Philippines. And those are the other items that we won. And the impact, of course, is the Philippines gained a maritime area larger than its land area, rich in resources. It has shrunk the disputed area. And well, as we know today, this has been shelved. The victory has been shelved under the presidency of Duterte, but that's a story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kawi.
Well, thank you very much. I'm from Thailand. I must say that we don't have any claim, and I will not state one. The only claim I have is that Thailand has a civilian government. Having said that, my presentations, the only reason I'm here is that Thailand is the chair of ASEAN this year and has done a miraculous job trying to hold together, as you can see. I'm not going back history of 100 years, 50 years. My history is only 34 years. It will start in 1995. The so-called ASEAN and China tussle, COC endgame, while we live in the Marvel Comic-Con, so I have to be a little bit modern. The timeline, so we all have timeline, but my timeline, we have 3 critical times. In 1995, I was fortunate at the time, I was a note taker. This was the first time. The reason why I have to mention this 1995, the first informal senior official discussion between China and ASEAN in Hangzhou, April 5th at 8 o'clock. It was historic for me because I was a note taker. And the person who was in the room was Vice Foreign Minister Tang Jia-suan. He was a bit red-faced at the time. He drank too much because it was after dinner. And in the room, the other nemesis of him from ASEAN, this person was other than Kishore Mahbubani. The reason I have to mention this because Kishore was the first person to raise that in order to establish trust and confidence in relation between ASEAN and China, China has to be, for the first time, use the word transparent. So the word transparency was used in 1995 by Mahbubani. I overheard the young translator who translated this to Tang Jia-suan. She used the word "qingchu." You know that it means clear. But at that time, she did not use the word "touming," which means transparent. The word transparent used a lot by China after the year 2000, when China negotiated to become member of World Trade Organization. That's where the word governance and other related multilateralism come into play. And Tang Jia-suan at the time, I was sit opposite him, he was angry. The face was red. I almost turned green. And he responded, he said that, well, I understood Chinese a little bit, but understood enough. He said that all the time, Chinese policy towards South China Sea is very clear, qing qing chu chu. And that's it. The meeting broke down. at that moment on, in 1995, the question of transparency and trust become the key words in negotiating in the next 34 years. And I will not go into details. I think all the three panelists has mentioned in great details. But what made different was the whole development, how ASEAN realized that after all this, you have to engage with China. In 1995, you have to remember ASEAN's start the so-called ASEAN Regional Forum. ASEAN Regional Forum, as you know, was a new so-called regional platform to engage the major power. In the beginning, nobody trusted that China would be able to join. After they joined, nobody realized that China one day will be able to engage the rest of the so-called ASEAN Regional Forum member of the 27. So it was that time that ASEAN thought that we need to engage and that we need certain form of code of conduct. And that's the idea. So it takes the next 34 years, long discussion between ASEAN and China. Of course, I will focus on the table or the diplomatic gesture, the ups and downs of the negotiation. But for me, the most critical point, which Vituk mentioned, which will not duplicate with Stan, which focus on 2009, but for me is 2014 when Philippines act as a cowboy without consult with ASEAN, decided to go to Permanent Court of Arbitration. And that really pissed off ASEAN. And I'm sorry I have to say that because the response by that time, ASEAN was very weak, especially some of the non-claimant, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. But I think the outcome did have a positive impact that it's pressure China to move on and enter deep into negotiation with ASEAN. And it was unfortunate at that time when Philippines decided to go to the arbitration, its relation with the overall ASEAN's scheme of cooperation has been weakened tremendously. I think Philippines decided to divorce from ASEAN, and it weakened ASEAN common position on negotiation with China. That was sad. As you can see, when Duterte came back, embraced ASEAN, ASEAN suddenly solidarity also increased. And you can see after 2016, ASEAN-China relation negotiation over the DOC and COC has progressed. I will show you the next slides. This is very important. I have only 4 slides, but this one is important because in the past, the negotiation of South China Sea only focused on 2 things. There are always 2 sessions. The DOC, things that have been agreed in 2002, and then the Code of Conduct. So there's 2 sessions separately. It's only in the past few years after the arbitration decision that China start to talk about joint cooperation, and country like Thailand, country like non-claimant is trying to engage the China, is now trying to focus on maritime cooperation, which mentioned succinctly in the DOC. There's a series of activities that country involved in ASEAN and China should do. So the maritime cooperation has been introduced as the 3rd component. So from now on until, Premier Li Keqiang mentioned this in November last year. For the first time, give the time frame of 3 years that COC will be complete. At the moment, I'm not so sure, but I think since China has shown the enthusiasm to complete the COC by the 2021, we will have to watch carefully what China will do from now on until the 2021. But suffices to say, I think Thailand as chair in Philippines now as the coordinator, which has behaved rather well. Normally, coordinator will have a lot of things to raise, issue to put on the table, but so far, Philippines and Thailand, Philippines as chair, and Thailand as chair, Philippines as coordinator, working very well. So there's a lot of progress. So in the last meeting in Hangzhou, just a couple of weeks ago, the first word has been used. Substantive progress has been used after 3 decades. So ASEAN and China congratulate themselves that after all, despite all the our friend Gollings chronically mentioned, jot down the activities in South China Sea and all this, ASEAN and China continue to talk and help talk and talk and talk and talk, and they will continue to talk. So from now on, the discussion will focus on the maritime cooperation to ensure that it will create the 2 points that I made, the so-called trust, because I think ASEAN and China trust deficit still high, especially on the intention of China. And I think China has now become more forthcoming in the detail of discussion with ASEAN. So the so-called maritime cooperation, as you know, I think in the futures, both ASEAN and China will agree on certain action. For example, which is non-lethal, of course, is on the maritime conservation, maritime protections, and also examine of tuna livestock in South China Sea. That kind of thing that would increase the trust. And if the trust increase, I think there will be accelerated negotiation on the code of conduct. As you can see, Thailand, as a chair, expect the first single text negotiation to be complete this year. And Vietnam, as the next ASEAN chair, will start the second reading. The second reading will be very important because for the first time, they will have all the input from all the ASEAN member and China, and now they will starting in detail, agree to not agree. Hopefully, by the end of next year, or in Brunei, the most sensitive issue that in everybody's mind is whether the whole negotiation will be binding or not. And this, I think, will be a big issue. And I think it's very hard for me to predict. But I am sure now that Li Keqiang has set the 3-year time frame, and I also think that there is a good reason for China to conclude the COC, and also for ASEAN. I think China has been held hostage by the discussion, by the events development in South China Sea for too long. It has tarnished China rise, the so-called peaceful rise. And I think the Chinese government now, especially under Xi Jinping, would like to express, show, demonstrate the new approach towards a neighboring country, particularly Southeast Asia, placing priorities in ASEAN. And as you can see, if you notice that the chairman's statement of late, the past 3 years, there is a cause called both sides want to turn maritime dispute into the sea of peace, prosperity, and sustainability. I think this is an ASEAN way to frame the Chinese behavior in the future to make sure that the area will be peaceful. And finally, I think China wants COC very much, and it will be binding. That's my take. Why? I think China is rising, and next year China, for the first time, will achieve the so-called Xiaokang, the moderate prosperous society, and it would all go well with the overall Chinese approach as the country that can live peacefully with ASEAN. So I think that's what China aims. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've heard 4 very interesting presentations on China's claims in the South China Sea, on China's and Vietnam's claims on the paracels, on the Philippine claims to their features, and how the kind of approach they have taken bilaterally with China through legal mechanisms and subsequently walked away from that. And then Kawi's presentation on how ASEAN, Southeast Asian claimants collectively through their membership in ASEAN have approached China and sought a code of conduct, which, Kawi, you sound relatively optimistic that it will be concluded and will be relatively substantive and binding. So let me open it up for questions. We have about 20 minutes. I will start with the gentleman here. Could you wait until the microphone arrives, and then please introduce yourself and ask just one question. Thank you.
Augustus Alzona, Filipino by birth, American by choice, subscribing to the neo-realist foreign policy viewpoint, but then I've had to sort of readjust it given the recent elections. The question is this, basically, isn't this basically sort of like a modern day rehash of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, that term from the last century, and sort of that you combine that with the idea of gunboat diplomacy, and I think to quote a famous Chinese leader about the power that flows from the barrel of a gun, and you just throw all that in, and that sort of, at least to me, it explains what's going on here. So I wondered if any of the panelists had any thoughts on that.
I'm going to group 3 questions together, and then we'll turn to our panelists. So Pooja here in the blue, the woman in the blue here.
Hi, thank you. My question is to Kavi. I'm very intrigued by your analysis where you say that China would want COC. If we follow the SNDT that was leaked last year, the single negotiation text, the entire crux of the document, if you see, there were 3 of them. That one, the China did not want any binding document. Second was that it wanted extra regional countries to be out of the COC negotiation. Third was that all the maritime delimitation case issues would be not a part of the COC document. Given this kind of document, if we come across, like if we finally get it, there would not be any teeth to the document. So even if it becomes binding later on, what is the use of such a document? Can you help me understand that?
You repeat again?
Do you want to try, Pooja?
Okay. Given the 3 conditions that the single negotiation draft text has, that the maritime delimitation issues would not be a part of the document, the document would not be legally binding, and third, the extra regional powers would be out of the COC negotiation. Given that kind of context, even if a COC comes into picture tomorrow, it doesn't have any relevance. What is your take on that?
One more question over here.
Do Thanh Hai from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. So I have one question to Sten and also one for Bill. Sten, correct me if I'm wrong. You will show in the history, the long history that different type of actors happen as a paracel in Vietnam. Start from 17th century and French come and China come, and also the rules of the international law is that you cannot allow to use force to gain territory, right? So, and also the effective occupation. And China used force in 1974, and the choice of critical date at 2009 is that to make sure, is that to allow that to legitimize the use of force to gain the paracel. At that time, you all know that China is latecomer from both Jura Paracel and to Spratly, and also the choice of critical date that will be very significant in the way that would not be more helpful to understand the nature of the dispute there. And one to build that we won't have the biggest fake news of the history now, I mean with the 9-dash line, and how we should communicate with the Chinas on that to make sure that it will be understand across the board, that your history could not be used, as a pretext for, I mean, the force to be used on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we go in reverse order, and I'll start with Kawi to answer the code of conduct question.
I must tell you, I don't know the details of the discussion, but all the issues that you discuss have not, according to my view, discussed officially. That's the important thing. I think it will be discussed as it proceeds by incrementally taking the less sensitive area, less sensitive issue. The one that you mentioned will be, I think, the last. A lot of things has been leaked out saying that it has been add up all this list, but it has not yet been discussed at all. That is why I cannot say. My enthusiasm of China was based on the desire of China trying to present itself as a nation that respects international rule of law within the context of South China Sea. And I think judging from the reading, judging from the past 2 years, I think China has changed its attitude toward ASEAN, towards COC. So we still have to see, because the trust, I think ASEAN and China at the moment does not have the same level of trust like in the first cycle of diamond relation 25 years. Now, if you watch carefully, ASEAN determine the status of the relation with China on a day-to-day basis on the reality on the ground. And China know this. That is why the strategic action plan this time, the language is not as strong as before.
Maritas, do you want to take the gunboat diplomacy question? Oh, you don't? Okay. Okay, we'll save that. Bill might want to tackle that along with the other question he was asked. Dr. Tonneson?
The return to the Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and cannon boat diplomacy, not quite yet, but the power in the South China Sea has changed many times in modern history. In the 17th century, it was quite dominated by China. That was between the Dutch and the Portuguese period, and in the 19th century, it was the European century with Britain and France, and then the United States. And then you got a kind of condominium in the 20th century where Japan was held down with limits to its naval forces. And Japan had its short period where it was creating the South China Sea as a kind of Japanese lake. And then after that, there has been a US domination which has lasted until recently. And this period has at the same time allowed the institution of international law through one fantastic progress, which also China took part in, which was to agree on the Law of the Sea Convention in 1982, which has been ratified by all the countries around the South China Sea. What is despicable to see now is how China does not respect basic tenets of that convention. And for this, I think that the arbitral tribunal's award was also detrimental, because it caused such a defeat for China legally that it severely reduces any chance that China would, even after political change in Beijing, if that should happen, would come back to a solution that would be based on the law of the sea. If China could argue, with Taiwanese help, that Ituaba is the only island in the Spratly group that can have an exclusive economic zone of its own, then China would be able to get a reasonable part of the South China Sea as its exclusive economic zone in the northern part, because it would, in a way, unite Woody Island in the paracels with Ituaba, with the capacity to generate such a zone. So the really disappointing thing about the arbitral tribunal was that it took up Ituaba and decided as law that Ituaba cannot generate such a zone. Then there is little fallback position for China. So now you see China using illegal means to force a use of the U-shaped line, which is completely in violation of the law of the sea. That makes me fear that we will end up with just power deciding. For the question about Vietnam, my basic argument is that no single country can have sovereignty to all the Spratlys. When France in 1930 first declared its sovereignty claim in the Spratlys in a diplomatic message to the UK, it drew a line like this around the Spratlys and said everything inside is ours. The British government told the French that you can't do that. This is not how you make international law and how you claim sovereignty. You must name the islands and claim just the islands, not everything within a line. And France listened, so in 1933 it demanded sovereignty to 6 named islands. And the UK more or less accepted this by letting its own claim to some of those islands from 1877, letting that dormant. Later on, the Philippines made the same mistake as France when it created Freedom Land, drawing a map and saying everything inside here is our freedom land. And it took a long time for the Philippines to discover that this was not the way you can do international law, and then start claiming islands. And then China has done exactly the same mistake with the U-shaped line, reinterpreting as a demand to everything that is inside it, which is completely in violation of international law. And sooner or later, China must give up that. But as long as it has growing power and does not see any chance of getting something that is satisfactory for it through international law, and has this problem of the division with Taiwan, it's unlikely that it will happen. Final word, the main basis for resolving sovereignty claims in the South China Sea is permanent occupation. And I think the only pragmatic solution is also to recognize sovereignty for those countries that currently occupy them and that have not taken them by force. So therefore, the Western paracels in 1974, the conquest of the Western paracels from the Republic of Vietnam, was illegal and should not give China any title.
Thank you. Bill, you can play sweep up on this round.
Thank you. And building on that, I mean, I generally agree exactly with what Steiner's been saying, that the only way to resolve this is to disaggregate the claims, is to, rather than talking about claims to entire archipelagos or every single feature, you break it up and you say, what about this one, what about this one? And actually, because the states have been fairly active in putting out versions of their claim into the public domain, we have most of that evidence available to us because we have documents from embassies and so forth, and we can actually assess a lot of the rival claims even without going to a big international tribunal. What I want to argue in terms of answering Hai's question, and I gave a talk at Fudan University in Shanghai last year, I wanted to argue that China's overall strategic interests are in collision with its territorial claims. Its overall strategic interests, as Kavi was saying, are in peaceful, constructive relations with Southeast Asia, and so therefore the feeling that Southeast Asia has that China is being an aggressive, expansionist power goes against its wider strategic interests. And when you look at China's situation in the Spratlys, it occupies 7 features. Is China's material security, strategic strength going to be enhanced by occupying an 8th feature? I would argue not. There is nothing to be gained from it that it doesn't already have from controlling the 3 large, 4 small bases that it currently does. So why can it not therefore publicly say that we are prepared to accept the status quo, Southeast Asia, we are not going to occupy any of your features, we will all live with what we have, uti possediatis, because the nationalist agenda is to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing, because this is rightfully Chinese territory. Which then leads us back, I think, to the question of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. All of this stuff comes from Chinese reformers and revolutionaries in the late 19th and early 20th century drinking from the cup of European nationalism, and they're still drunk on it. Okay? Europe has given up and decided that war is not the way to solve the Alsace-Lorraine question. Yeah? East Asia is still living this nightmare. I mean, who the F gives a damn about some of these islands? Okay? To quote Bill Murray in Meatballs, it just doesn't matter. All right? You get a few fish, but frankly, you can buy them on the open market, yeah, for cheaper than building a massive concrete installation. Yes, okay, you need your surveillance systems. Yes, but we're there. We're done now. Just stop it. Okay. If I could persuade China of that, then I think I would get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Okay, we have time for 1 or possibly 2 more questions, so I will go back out. There's a gentleman in the back. I'll go to him first.
Good afternoon. My name is Ili Wakim. I'm from Georgetown University. What is the predicted impact of the upcoming ASEAN-US maritime exercise for overall situation in the region? What should it do or demonstrate to be successful from ASEAN's view, from the bilateral view of each of the claimants, and from an international perspective? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's also an excellent question for Admiral Swift, our keynote speaker. So we'll see if anyone wants to take it, but we might save it for him as well. This gentleman here, microphone, the plaid shirt.
Zach Haver, Center for Advanced Defense Studies. This question is for Bill. I'm wondering, in your conversations with Taiwanese counterparts, is there any appetite for reforming the Taiwanese claims? What would that look like in practice? And would it accomplish anything, seeing as China lost the arbitration to the Philippines and has continued on anyways? Thank you.
We have only 5 minutes, so let me see. Does anyone have any remarks about the U.S.-ASEAN exercise that's planned in the Thailand year of ADMM+? What the impact will be?
Shortly, yeah. I think this is a very positive development. It will receive wide coverage, and I think ASEAN would like to push United States would like to push ASEAN to put a stronger word in the joint statement related to increase U.S. commitment in South China Sea. I mean, with the joint exercise thing, yes, I think, yeah, that would be.
Bill, do you want to take the last question that was posed?
Yeah, and I think the answer is, obviously it depends which Taiwanese people you're talking to. I mean, as we know, Taiwanese politics is hugely divided, and this, kind of one China, independence, autonomy divide cuts through absolutely every single issue. I got the impression from the few people I've spoken to, who are mainly, I guess, probably from the Green camp, that they personally would be in sympathy with it, that it would make things simpler, that it obviously plays into their wider agenda of separating the island from the PRC. But from the other side, I think that the emotional connection to a one China position is quite strong, and this, and the idea of asserting a single Chinese claim is an emotional part of that claim. And I get discussions, for example, say at the Prospect Foundation or something, you get people dropping hints and things, but I just think the potential costs are so great. If you go to the National Institute of South China Sea Studies in Haikou, in Hainan Island and PRC, you will find a display of historic documents, all of which came out of the Taiwan archives. Yeah, under the old Ma administration, there was a fair degree of cross-strait cooperation on this issue. Obviously, now there isn't. Yeah.
Okay, I have one announcement to make before we close this panel. We have lunch waiting for you outside, so I ask that you move to the buffet and grab a plate and come back. We are going to launch our keynote 15 minutes earlier than is on the schedule, so we will begin at 1 o'clock instead of 1:15, so you still have a half an hour to take a break, grab some lunch, come back in here, and we'll start back up at 1 o'clock. So now please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.